What started as a simple rental agreement turned into one of the most sophisticated frame jobs in criminal history. A small-town Arizona farmer, a retired sheriff, and $11 million that belonged to one of Mexico's most dangerous cartels. The beautiful part? They did it all with paperwork, patience, and the cartel's own accountant. Before I walk you through the full story, I just have a small favor to ask. Make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and let me know in the comments, what city are you watching from? It's always amazing to see how far this audience is reaching. Now let's get back to the story. The black SUV pulled into Jack Morrison's farm on a crisp October morning in 2017, dust trailing behind it like a warning. Jack had been expecting some kind of visit ever since he'd posted that warehouse space for rent sign on the highway. Times were tough, cattle prices were down, and the mortgage wasn't going to pay itself. Two men in expensive suits stepped out of the vehicle looking completely out of place against the backdrop of rusted farm equipment and dried desert grass. The older man introduced himself as Miguel Santos, representing Southwest Agricultural Logistics. His partner stayed silent, arms crossed, sunglasses reflecting the morning sun. Miguel explained that his company needed secure storage space for agricultural equipment and supplies being distributed throughout the Southwest. They had clients in Mexico who needed temporary storage facilities for seasonal overflow, and Jack's isolated farm was exactly what they were looking for. The offer was generous, $17,000 per month for exclusive use of Jack's largest barn, a corrugated metal structure that sat about a quarter-mile from the main farmhouse. Cash payments, 6 months in advance, with an option to extend the lease for 2 additional years. Miguel pulled out a manila envelope containing the first payment and a professionally prepared rental agreement. The contract looked completely legitimate, complete with a Phoenix business address, insurance documentation, and references to agricultural transport regulations. Everything appeared to be exactly what it claimed to be. Jack Morrison had been farming in Arizona for 37 years, and he had developed good instincts about people and situations that might cause him problems. Something about Miguel and his silent partner felt wrong, but $17,000 a month was more money than Jack had seen in years. Jack told Miguel he needed 24 hours to consider the offer. Miguel smiled and said that was perfectly reasonable, but mentioned that they had identified several other properties in the area and couldn't wait indefinitely for a decision. Miguel left his business card and drove away, leaving Jack with the envelope of cash and a decision that would change his life forever. That evening, Jack walked across the fence line to visit his neighbor, Frank Williams, a 68-year-old retired sheriff who owned the adjacent property. Frank had spent 40 years in law enforcement, including 15 years with the county sheriff's department and 10 years as a private investigator after retirement. Frank listened to Jack's description of the visitors and the rental offer with the kind of professional attention that came from decades of listening to stories that didn't quite add up. Frank's questions were pointed. Why would a legitimate agricultural company pay so much for storage in such a remote location? Why cash instead of checks? Why the urgency about making a decision? Frank's law enforcement experience told him that Southwest Agricultural Logistics was probably not what it claimed to be. The cash payments, the isolated location, and the professional appearance of the visitors suggested that Jack was being recruited for something that would not involve legitimate agricultural supplies. Frank advised Jack to be extremely careful about accepting the rental agreement, but he also recognized that Jack was in serious financial difficulty and might not have many alternatives. Frank suggested that if Jack decided to proceed with the rental, he should document everything carefully and be prepared for the possibility that his property might be used for illegal activities. Jack spent a sleepless night considering his options. He needed the money desperately, but he also understood that getting involved with criminals could cost him his farm, his freedom, or even his life. Jack finally decided that he would accept the rental agreement, but would take Frank's advice about documenting everything that happened on his property. The next morning, Jack called the number on Miguel's business card and agreed to the rental terms. Miguel arrived within 2 hours with additional paperwork and the remainder of the first payment. Miguel seemed pleased but not surprised by Jack's decision, as if he had known that the financial pressure would ultimately force Jack to accept their offer. Miguel explained that his company would begin using the storage facility within a few days, and that Jack should expect regular deliveries during evening hours when traffic on the highway would be minimal. Miguel emphasized that discretion was important to his company's operations, and that Jack would be compensated generously for maintaining privacy about their activities. Jack signed the rental agreement and deposited the cash payment in his bank account, officially beginning what would become a 3-year relationship with people who were definitely not in the agricultural logistics business. Jack had no idea that he had just rented his barn to money laundering specialists who worked for the Hermanos del Desierto cartel. But Jack Morrison was not the kind of man who simply took money and asked no questions. Jack had spent nearly 4 decades working hard and playing by the rules, and he had developed strong opinions about people who made their money through illegal activities. Jack was about to embark on a course of action that would require patience, intelligence, and a willingness to take enormous risks. 3 years later, on a moonless night in March 2020, Jack Morrison and 2 young men were moving through his barn with the efficiency of professional thieves. The barn that had once housed farm equipment now contained dozens of wooden crates marked with shipping labels from various Mexican agricultural companies. Jack's movements were deliberate and practiced as he directed the 2 helpers toward specific crates that had been marked with small chalk symbols. These crates contained approximately $11 million in cash that belonged to the Hermanos del Desierto cartel and was being temporarily stored before transferred to money laundering operations throughout the Southwest. The 2 young men helping Jack were Frank Williams' nephews, college students who had been told they were participating in a law enforcement operation that required complete secrecy. The nephews believed they were helping to gather evidence against criminals, not commit what would become one of the largest cash thefts in Arizona history. Jack and his helpers worked with military precision, removing the original crates and replacing them with identical containers filled with sand and concrete blocks. The replacement crates had been prepared over several months and were perfect replicas of the originals, complete with authentic shipping labels and official seals that would pass casual inspection. The operation required exactly 2 hours and 17 minutes to complete. Every movement had been choreographed through months of practice sessions conducted in Frank's barn, using empty crates and simulated conditions. Jack and his team knew exactly where each crate was located and which ones contained the cash shipments. The barn's security cameras had been temporarily disabled using techniques that Frank had learned during his law enforcement career. The cameras would resume normal operation after the theft was completed, but their memory systems would show no record of the nighttime activities that had taken place in the storage facility. Jack had spent months studying the cartel's storage and transportation procedures, learning their schedules and identifying the timing of major cash shipments. Jack knew that the crates they were stealing contained money that had been collected from drug sales throughout the region and was being prepared for transfer to Mexico. The stolen money was immediately loaded into a hay trailer that appeared to contain normal agricultural products, but actually had hidden compartments designed to conceal large quantities of cash. Jack had modified the trailer himself, using his mechanical skills and Frank's knowledge of law enforcement search procedures to create storage spaces that would be virtually impossible to detect during casual inspection. Jack drove the loaded hay trailer to a prearranged location where Frank was waiting with additional vehicles and equipment for processing the stolen cash. Frank had established a secure facility where they could count and repackage the money without being observed by anyone who might report their activities to law enforcement or criminal organizations. The counting process revealed that Jack and his team had stolen approximately $11 million in various denominations of currency. The money was packed in vacuum-sealed bags that were designed to prevent detection by drug-sniffing dogs and other law enforcement detection methods. Frank immediately began implementing procedures for concealing and laundering the stolen money that he had developed during his years of investigating financial crimes. Frank understood that simply possessing $11 million in cash would make Jack a target for both law enforcement and criminal organizations that would spare no expense to recover their stolen assets. Jack returned to his farm before dawn and resumed his normal routine as if nothing unusual had happened during the night. The empty barn still contained dozens of crates that appeared to be exactly the same as those that had been stored there for months. Nobody would discover the theft until the cartel attempted to transport the money to its next destination. Jack's performance during the days following the theft was flawless. Jack continued his normal farming activities and maintained the same relationships with his neighbors and business associates that he had cultivated for decades. Jack gave no indication that his life had been fundamentally changed by the possession of $11 million in stolen cartel money. The theft would not be discovered for another 6 days, giving Jack and Frank substantial time to secure their stolen assets and implement the complex plan they had developed for framing someone else for the crime. Jack had not simply stolen $11 million. He had executed the first phase of an elaborate scheme designed to ensure that he would never be suspected of involvement in the theft. The transformation of Jack Morrison from honest farmer to sophisticated criminal mastermind had begun 18 months earlier when he realized that the agricultural supplies being stored in his barn were actually large quantities of cash from cartel money laundering operations. Jack's discovery came during a routine maintenance visit to the barn when he accidentally observed Miguel Santos and several associates opening crates and examining bundles of currency. Jack realized immediately that he had become an unwitting participant in a major criminal conspiracy that could result in federal charges if he was ever identified as a knowing accomplice. Jack's initial instinct was to terminate the rental agreement and distance himself from whatever illegal activities were taking place on his property. But Jack also understood that simply asking the cartel to leave might not be possible if they believed he had gained knowledge that could threaten their operations. Frank Williams had advised Jack to be extremely careful about any attempt to withdraw from his relationship with the cartel, pointing out that criminal organizations typically eliminated security risks rather than negotiating with them. Frank suggested that Jack's safest option might be to continue the rental arrangement while gathering information that could be used to protect himself if he was ever questioned by law enforcement. Jack and Frank began developing a plan that would allow Jack to terminate his relationship with the cartel while acquiring enough of their money to compensate him for the risks he had taken and the problems he had endured. Frank's law enforcement experience provided crucial insights into how such an operation could be conducted without leaving evidence that could be traced back to Jack. Frank's plan was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its execution. Instead of simply stealing money and fleeing, Frank proposed that Jack should frame someone within the cartel organization for the theft, while simultaneously creating documentation that would make Jack appear to be a victim rather than a perpetrator. The key to Frank's plan was Luis Mendoza, the cartel's accountant who visited Jack's farm monthly to verify inventory and reconcile shipping records. Luis was a meticulous professional who maintained detailed documentation of all cartel assets and was trusted by the organization's leadership to ensure the accuracy of their financial operations. Frank realized that Luis's position made him the perfect scapegoat for a sophisticated theft that would appear to be an inside job conducted by someone with intimate knowledge of the cartel's operations and access to their most sensitive financial information. Frank's plan would make Luis appear to be a corrupt accountant who had betrayed his employers for personal gain. Frank's strategy required Jack to create false documentation that would implicate Luis while simultaneously establishing Jack's innocence. This documentation would include rental agreements, shipping records, and financial documents that would suggest Luis had been using Jack's farm for unauthorized storage of stolen cartel assets. The creation of false documentation required several months of careful preparation. Frank used his knowledge of legal procedures and investigative techniques to create documents that would appear authentic to anyone conducting a subsequent investigation. Frank also established a shell company that would serve as the apparent legitimate renter of Jack's storage facility. Jack began substituting false documents for authentic records whenever Luis visited the farm for his monthly inspections. Jack gradually replaced shipping labels, inventory lists, and rental agreements with modified versions that would support the narrative Frank had created about Luis's fictional theft operation. Luis had no knowledge that Jack was systematically creating evidence that would implicate him in crimes he had never committed. Luis continued his monthly inspections with professional thoroughness, never suspecting that his signatures on routine documents were being used to construct an elaborate frame job. Frank's plan also required Jack to establish alibis and documentation that would prove his innocence if he was ever investigated in connection with the theft. Frank helped Jack create records showing that he had attempted to report suspicious activities to law enforcement agencies, but had been advised to continue cooperation to avoid alerting the criminals to official interest in their operations. Jack spent months learning about the cartel's operational procedures and security measures, gathering information that would be crucial for executing the theft, while ensuring that the investigation would focus on Luis rather than external thieves. Jack's position as the farm owner gave him access to information that would be impossible for outside criminals to obtain. Frank's law enforcement contacts provided additional resources for creating documentation and establishing secure methods for laundering the stolen money after the theft was completed. Frank had maintained relationships with former colleagues who could provide assistance without understanding the true nature of the operation they were supporting. On March 15, 2020, exactly 4 days before the theft that would destroy his life, Luis Mendoza conducted what he believed was a routine monthly inspection of the storage facility on Jack Morrison's farm. Luis had been performing these inspections for over 2 years, and he approached this visit with the same professional thoroughness that had made him a trusted employee of the Hermanos del Desierto cartel. Luis arrived at Jack's farm driving a rented sedan that gave no indication of his connection to criminal organizations. Luis appeared to be exactly what he claimed to be, a logistics coordinator for an agricultural supply company conducting routine inventory verification. Luis carried a clipboard with shipping manifests and a portable computer for updating electronic records. Jack greeted Luis with the same casual friendliness that had characterized their relationship since the rental arrangement began. Jack offered Luis coffee and made small talk about weather conditions and agricultural prices, while Luis prepared his equipment for the inspection process. Luis's inspection procedure was methodical and comprehensive. Luis opened every crate in the storage facility and verified that the contents matched the shipping documentation. Luis checked serial numbers, counted bundles, and photographed container contents for inclusion in his electronic reports. Jack observed Luis's inspection with apparent disinterest, appearing to be concerned only with maintaining his equipment and preparing for spring planting activities. Jack gave no indication that he was memorizing every detail of Luis's procedures and timing every aspect of the inspection process. Luis discovered no discrepancies during his inspection. Every crate contained exactly what the shipping documents indicated, and the total value of stored assets matched Luis's computerized records perfectly. Luis updated his electronic files and prepared documentation confirming that all cartel assets were secure and properly accounted for. Luis's final task was signing off on documents that confirmed the accuracy of his inspection and authorized continued storage of the cartel's assets at Jack's facility. Luis signed these documents with the same routine professionalism he had displayed during dozens of previous inspections, never suspecting that his signature was being used to establish his apparent responsibility for the assets. Jack witnessed Luis's signature and provided his own signature as the property owner, confirming that the inspection had been completed according to established procedures. Jack's signature appeared on documents that would later be used to establish his cooperation with law enforcement efforts to investigate the cartel's activities. Luis completed his inspection and departed from Jack's farm at approximately 4:30 p.m. on March 15th, satisfied that all cartel assets were secure and properly managed. Luis had no way of knowing that Jack had been documenting his procedures and that Frank Williams was already implementing the final phases of their plan to steal $11 million and frame Luis for the theft. Luis drove away from Jack's farm for the last time, unaware that he had just 6 hours left to live. Frank's plan required Luis to be eliminated before he could defend himself against the accusations that would emerge after the theft was discovered. Frank had arranged for Luis to be killed in a way that would suggest he had been murdered by rival criminals competing for control of the stolen money. Luis's death was carefully orchestrated to occur at a location and time that would support the narrative Frank had created about Luis's fictional criminal activities. Luis was found dead in his apartment 2 days after the theft was discovered, apparently killed during a robbery that had gone wrong when thieves attempted to force him to reveal the location of money he had stolen from his cartel employers. The timing of Luis's death was crucial to Frank's plan because it prevented Luis from providing testimony that might have contradicted the false evidence that Jack and Frank had created. Luis's murder would be attributed to rival criminals, but it actually served Frank's purpose of silencing the only person who could have exposed the frame job. Luis Mendoza died believing that he was an honest accountant who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time when criminal organizations decided to eliminate him as a security risk. Luis never learned that his death had been planned months in advance by people he had trusted, and that his murder was an essential component of a sophisticated theft operation. Jack Morrison attended Luis's funeral and expressed appropriate sympathy for the loss of someone he described as a dedicated professional who had always treated him with courtesy and respect. Jack's performance at the funeral was flawless, giving no indication that he had been responsible for creating the circumstances that led to Luis's death. The theft itself was a masterpiece of timing, preparation, and misdirection that demonstrated Frank Williams's deep understanding of criminal investigation procedures and Jack Morrison's intimate knowledge of the cartel's operational patterns. Every aspect of the operation had been planned to create evidence pointing toward Luis Mendoza, while eliminating any traces that could connect Jack or Frank to the missing money. Frank had identified the optimal time for the theft by analyzing the cartel's transportation schedules and security procedures. Frank knew that the storage facility would contain maximum cash assets immediately before quarterly transfer operations that moved accumulated money to Mexican processing centers. The timing was crucial because Frank needed the theft to be discovered after Luis had completed his inspection, but before Luis could be questioned about discrepancies in his records. Frank's plan required Luis to appear responsible for the theft while being unable to provide explanations that might expose the true circumstances of the crime. Frank had temporarily disabled the barn's security system, using techniques that would make the malfunction appear to be the result of equipment failure rather than deliberate sabotage. Frank's law enforcement background had taught him exactly how to create electronic malfunctions that would not be detected during subsequent forensic analysis. The replacement crates that Jack and his helpers installed were perfect replicas that had been prepared over several months, using materials and techniques that Frank had researched through his law enforcement contacts. The false crates would pass casual inspection and would only reveal their true contents if they were opened by cartel personnel attempting to access the money. Jack's helpers completed their work without understanding the true nature of the operation they were participating in. Frank had told his nephews that they were gathering evidence for a federal investigation and that their activities were being conducted under the supervision of law enforcement agencies that required complete secrecy. The stolen money was immediately processed through procedures that Frank had developed for concealing large quantities of cash without triggering banking regulations or law enforcement surveillance. Frank's experience with financial crime investigations had taught him exactly how criminals moved and laundered stolen assets. Frank's laundering operation was sophisticated enough to defeat most law enforcement detection methods, while being simple enough to be implemented by people without extensive criminal experience. Frank understood that the most successful money laundering operations used legitimate business activities to disguise the source and movement of criminal proceeds. Jack's role after the theft was to maintain his normal routine, while appearing to be increasingly concerned about unusual activities he had observed on his property. Jack began reporting suspicious behavior to local law enforcement agencies, establishing a documented pattern of cooperation that would protect him when the theft was eventually discovered. Frank had prepared detailed scripts for Jack to follow when he was inevitably questioned about the theft. Jack's responses would demonstrate appropriate shock and concern, while providing information that would direct investigators toward Luis rather than toward external thieves who might have had inside information about the cartel's operations. The discovery of the theft occurred exactly when Frank had predicted it would. Cartel personnel arrived to transport the stored money to Mexico and immediately realized that the crates contained sand instead of cash. The cartel's investigation began within hours and followed exactly the path that Frank had planned. The cartel's investigators quickly identified Luis as the most likely suspect for the theft because he was the only person outside the organization who had detailed knowledge about the storage facility and access to the financial records necessary to plan such a sophisticated operation. Luis's recent inspection of the facility made him appear to be the last person who could have verified that the money was still secure. Frank's false documentation supported every aspect of the case against Luis. The modified rental agreement suggested that Luis had been using Jack's farm for unauthorized storage of assets that he had stolen from his cartel employers. The shipping records indicated that Luis had been systematically diverting money to his personal operations over a period of several months. Jack's testimony to cartel investigators was perfectly consistent with the false evidence that Frank had created. Jack appeared to be a victim of Luis's criminal activities rather than a participant in the theft. Jack's cooperation with the investigation further established his apparent innocence and provided additional evidence against Luis. The cartel's investigation concluded that Luis had been operating a sophisticated theft operation that had cost the organization $11 million and had compromised the security of their entire money laundering network. Luis's death was attributed to rival criminals who had murdered him to gain access to the stolen money. The discovery that $11 million had vanished from their Arizona storage facility sent shockwaves through the Hermanos del Desierto cartel and triggered the most intensive internal investigation in the organization's 30-year history. The theft represented not just a massive financial loss, but a catastrophic security breach that threatened to expose their entire money laundering network to law enforcement scrutiny. The cartel's security chief, Roberto Vega, immediately sealed the storage facility and began documenting evidence that might reveal how the theft had been executed and who was responsible for the massive security failure. Roberto's preliminary investigation revealed that the missing money had been replaced with sand and concrete blocks in a sophisticated operation that required detailed knowledge of the cartel's procedures. Roberto's analysis of the physical evidence revealed that the theft had been conducted by professionals who understood the cartel's security measures and had access to inside information about shipping schedules and storage procedures. The precision of the operation and the quality of the replacement crates suggested that the thieves had been planning the operation for months. Roberto immediately began investigating everyone who had access to information about the storage facility or knowledge about the cartel's financial operations. Roberto's investigation focused on employees, contractors, and business associates who might have betrayed the organization for financial gain or under pressure from law enforcement agencies. Luis Mendoza emerged as the primary suspect almost immediately because of his position as the cartel's financial coordinator and his recent inspection of the compromised storage facility. Roberto discovered that Luis had signed documents confirming the security of assets that had actually been stolen, making him appear to be either incompetent or deliberately involved in the theft. Roberto's investigation of Luis's background revealed no obvious indications of disloyalty or financial problems that might have motivated him to steal from his employers. Luis appeared to be exactly what he had always been, a competent professional who performed his duties efficiently and maintained the confidentiality required by his position. But Roberto's analysis of the shipping documents and rental agreements revealed disturbing evidence that Luis had been conducting unauthorized activities using the cartel's assets. The modified documents that Jack and Frank had created suggested that Luis had been systematically diverting money to personal operations that had escaped detection for months. Roberto's questioning of Jack Morrison provided additional evidence against Luis while establishing Jack's apparent innocence. Jack's testimony described Luis as someone who had seemed increasingly nervous during recent visits and who had asked unusual questions about the security arrangements at the storage facility. Jack's cooperation with Roberto's investigation was complete and apparently sincere. Jack provided access to all documents related to the rental arrangement and expressed shock and anger about being deceived by someone he had trusted to conduct legitimate business activities on his property. Roberto's investigation also revealed that Luis had been killed 2 days after the theft was discovered, apparently by rival criminals who had learned about his theft operation and had attempted to force him to reveal the location of the stolen money. Luis's death eliminated the possibility that he could provide explanations that might have contradicted the evidence against him. The timing of Luis's death convinced Roberto that Luis had indeed been responsible for the theft and had been eliminated by competitors who wanted to acquire the stolen assets for themselves. Roberto concluded that Luis's murder proved his guilt and demonstrated that the cartel security had been compromised by an internal betrayal rather than external infiltration. Roberto's final report identified Luis as the perpetrator of the theft and recommended that the cartel implement new security measures to prevent similar betrayals by trusted employees. Roberto's investigation focused on improving internal controls rather than pursuing the stolen money, which Roberto assumed had been acquired by rival criminals who had murdered Luis. The cartel's leadership accepted Roberto's conclusions and began implementing new procedures designed to prevent future thefts by employees who might be tempted to steal organizational assets. The investigation was officially closed with Luis identified as the guilty party and his death serving as appropriate punishment for his betrayal. Jack Morrison was praised by cartel leadership for his cooperation during the investigation and was offered an extended rental agreement with increased payments as compensation for the problems he had experienced. Jack declined the offer, explaining that the recent events had made him uncomfortable about continuing any business relationship with the organization. The cartel respected Jack's decision and terminated the rental arrangement without any pressure or threats. Jack's behavior during the investigation had convinced cartel leadership that he was an innocent victim who had been deceived by Luis's criminal activities and who deserved to be left alone to resume his normal farming operations. Jack's performance during the investigation was so convincing that Roberto recommended him to other cartel associates as an example of the kind of reliable business partner who could be trusted to maintain confidentiality while providing services to legitimate operations. Roberto never suspected that Jack had been the mastermind behind the theft that had cost the organization $11 million. Frank Williams had spent 40 years in law enforcement learning exactly how criminals moved and concealed stolen assets. And he used this knowledge to design a money laundering operation that would defeat the same investigative techniques he had once used to track financial crimes. Frank's plan for converting $11 million in stolen cash into legitimate assets was as sophisticated as any operation that professional money launderers had ever developed. Frank's strategy was based on the principle that the most successful money laundering operations used legitimate business activities to disguise the source and movement of criminal proceeds. Frank identified several business sectors where large cash transactions were normal and where the source of money was rarely questioned by authorities or business partners. Frank's first step was purchasing a fleet of used agricultural equipment that could be bought with cash and quickly resold for legitimate business checks. Frank used Jack's connections in the farming community to identify equipment dealers who regularly handled large cash transactions and who did not ask detailed questions about the source of their customers' money. The equipment purchases allowed Frank to convert approximately $2 million in stolen cash into legitimate business assets within the first 3 months after the theft. Frank then sold the equipment to dealers in other states, receiving payments in the form of business checks that could be deposited in legitimate bank accounts without triggering federal reporting requirements. Frank also established several small businesses that provided services to the agricultural community throughout Arizona. These businesses generated legitimate income while providing cover for depositing large amounts of cash that Frank claimed represented payments from customers who preferred to conduct business without creating extensive paper trails. Frank's businesses included equipment repair services, agricultural consulting, and grain storage operations that could plausibly generate substantial cash income from customers throughout the region. Frank hired legitimate employees and conducted actual business activities to ensure that the operations would pass scrutiny from tax authorities or law enforcement agencies. Jack participated in Frank's money laundering operation by purchasing expensive farm equipment and making improvements to his property that could be paid for with legitimate business funds. Jack's purchases included new irrigation systems, livestock, and building renovations that substantially increased the value of his farm while providing explanations for his improved financial situation. Frank's most sophisticated laundering technique involved establishing investment partnerships with legitimate business owners who were looking for silent partners to provide capital for expansion projects. Frank used his law enforcement contacts to identify trustworthy business people who could provide legitimate returns on investments made with laundered money. Frank's investment strategy allowed him to place approximately $4 million in legitimate business ventures that generated regular income while providing complete documentation for the source and use of the invested funds. Frank's investments included construction projects, restaurant operations, and transportation companies that could absorb large amounts of capital without attracting unwanted attention. Frank also used his knowledge of legal procedures to establish trust funds and investment accounts that would protect laundered assets from seizure, even if law enforcement agencies eventually discovered their criminal origin. Frank's legal preparations included creating documentation that would make it extremely difficult for authorities to prove that specific assets had been purchased with stolen money. Jack's role in the laundering operation was to maintain his legitimate farming business while gradually improving his financial situation in ways that would appear to result from successful agricultural operations rather than criminal activities. Jack documented his farm's improved productivity and profitability to explain his enhanced lifestyle and increased property values. Frank and Jack completed their money laundering operation over a period of 18 months, converting all $11 million in stolen cash into legitimate assets that could be used without fear of detection or seizure. Frank's operation was so successful that tax authorities actually commended Jack for his improved record-keeping and increased tax payments. The laundered money, provided both men with sufficient assets to maintain comfortable lifestyles while planning their eventual retirement from farming and law enforcement consulting. Frank and Jack had not only stolen $11 million from a dangerous cartel, but had successfully converted their theft into legitimate wealth that could support them for the rest of their lives. Frank's final step in the laundering process was establishing offshore accounts and international investments that would allow both men to access their assets from anywhere in the world. Frank's international financial arrangements provided complete anonymity while ensuring that their money would remain secure even if they needed to leave the United States permanently. Jack Morrison's decision to sell his farm and disappear from Arizona was carefully planned to appear like a natural retirement decision by a successful farmer who wanted to enjoy his remaining years in a more comfortable climate. Jack's farm sale was structured to provide maximum legitimate proceeds while eliminating any connections between his property and the criminal activities that had taken place there. Jack hired a legitimate real estate agent and listed his farm at market value, attracting several qualified buyers who had no knowledge of the property's recent history. Jack accepted an offer from a young farming family who planned to continue agricultural operations and who had no connections to criminal organizations or law enforcement agencies. The farm sale proceeded through normal legal channels with complete documentation and appropriate tax payments that established Jack as a legitimate seller with clean title to his property. Jack's behavior during the sale process was exactly what would be expected from someone who had successfully operated a family farm for decades and was ready to retire. Jack used the proceeds from his farm sale to purchase a modest retirement home in a different state, establishing legitimate reasons for his departure from Arizona while maintaining documentation that would support his cover story if he was ever questioned about his activities. Jack's retirement plans appeared completely normal to his neighbors and business associates. Frank Williams implemented his own departure strategy 2 months after Jack completed his farm sale. Frank listed his ranch with a different real estate agent and accepted an offer from an investment group that planned to develop the property for residential use. Frank's sale also proceeded through legitimate channels with complete documentation and appropriate legal procedures. Frank used his connections in the aviation community to arrange private transportation that would allow him to leave the United States without creating official records that could be easily traced by law enforcement agencies. Frank's flight plan indicated a domestic destination, but the aircraft actually continued to an international airport where connections could be made to flights heading overseas. Frank's departure from the United States was timed to coincide with a legitimate vacation that he had planned and discussed with his neighbors for several months. Frank's travel arrangements appeared to be exactly what he had described: a retired law enforcement officer taking an extended international vacation using money he had saved during his career. Jack's departure was similarly disguised as a normal retirement relocation that included plans for extensive travel to visit family members and explore new hobbies. Jack had discussed these plans with his neighbors and had even shown them travel brochures and hotel reservations that supported his stated intentions. The timing of their departures was carefully coordinated to avoid creating any appearance of a planned escape by criminal associates. Jack and Frank left Arizona at different times, used different travel methods, and provided different explanations for their decisions to relocate. Frank's private aircraft was tracked to Denver, where official records indicated that he had connected to a commercial flight bound for Buenos Aires, Argentina. Frank's travel documentation showed that he was planning an extended vacation in South America to pursue his interest in historical sites and archaeological research. Jack's departure was less well documented, but neighbors reported that he had mentioned plans to visit family members in different parts of the country before making final decisions about where to establish his retirement residence. Jack's travel plans seemed appropriate for someone who had spent decades focused on farming and was finally free to explore other interests. 1 month after Frank's documented arrival in Argentina, resort staff at an exclusive facility in Fiji reported the arrival of 2 American guests who matched the general descriptions of Frank Williams and Jack Morrison. The guests were traveling on legitimate passports and had properly documented their entry into the country as tourists. The 2 Americans behaved exactly as wealthy retirees would be expected to behave during an extended tropical vacation. They participated in resort activities, hired local guides for fishing expeditions, and spent their evenings dining at restaurants that catered to international visitors. Their behavior attracted no attention from local authorities or other guests. However, the true identities of these two tourists could never be definitively established. The names on their passports did not match any known records of Frank Williams or Jack Morrison, and their appearances had been subtly altered in ways that made positive identification impossible. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one.